The battlefield was a wasteland of ash and smoke, a desolate expanse where the screams of the dying were drowned out by the roar of elemental forces at war. The wind howled like a creature in pain, the earth trembled beneath every footstep, and fire rose from the ground in jagged, molten spikes. In the sky above, a storm of lightning cracked like a whip, sizzling through the haze. At the heart of the chaos stood Liang Feng, the calm eye of the storm. He looked almost out of place amid the destruction, unbothered, unruffled, and a little bored. His face was a mask of quiet focus, as though this was just another Tuesday morning for him. Around him, soldiers scrambled for their lives as blasts of fire and ice ripped the earth apart, but he stood rooted to the spot, hands clasped behind his back. Across the battlefield, General Beryl of the rival nation, an imposing figure in heavy crimson armor, raised his arm high, summoning a towering fireball that spun in the air like a mini-sun. His soldiers cheered, rallying around their commander, who was known to be one of the fiercest elementalists alive. "This ends now," Beryl bellowed, his voice booming over the cacophony. He hurled the fireball toward Feng, a promise of obliteration in his eyes. Feng didn't move. He simply watched the inferno race toward him, a dance of flames and destruction. The fireball was as large as a house, its heat radiating out in waves. It looked unstoppable. The moment it was within 10 feet of him, Feng raised a single finger. The fireball froze midair, hanging there for a moment in stunned silence. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, Feng extinguished it. The flames simply vanished, as if they had never been there. Beryl's jaw dropped. Feng didn't bother to look at him. Instead, he closed his eyes briefly, concentrating, and with an almost imperceptible gesture of his hand, the ground beneath them cracked wide open. A massive chasm spread across the battlefield, swallowing dozens of soldiers, while Beryl's entire squad stumbled backward in confusion. A gust of wind followed, strong enough to send soldiers flying. They crashed against rocks, trees, and each other like ragdolls. Feng's eyes flicked over them with disinterest. "It was almost too easy, Beryl's voice faltered, his eyes wide with disbelief. The mighty general, leader of armies, conqueror of nations, stood before this lone figure, who had single-handedly obliterated the core of his military's might. For a moment, Beryl was unsure if Feng was even human. "You were going to win this war," Feng said softly, his voice carrying over the noise. "You're not even close." And then, with the snap of his fingers, the wind shifted once more, carrying the ground with it. The entire area trembled as rocks and dirt lifted into the air, spinning like a tornado of destruction. Beryl's army scattered, unable to keep their footing, their weapons useless against the fury that surged from Feng. But then, something strange happened. In the midst of the storm, Feng's gaze turned upward, his eyes narrowing. The sky, once dark with smoke, was now glowing faintly. An ominous rift had opened in the heavens, its edges crackling with energy that pulsed in rhythmic, unnatural waves. Feng's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't part of his plan. "I wasn't supposed to use that." His voice was barely a whisper, yet it seemed to echo over the battlefield. The rift expanded, and an unnatural calm settled over the storm. Feng paused, his powers momentarily stilled, his eyes drawn to the eerie light above. The crack in the sky was growing, spreading like a cancerous wound on the fabric of the world itself. The soldiers around him were still scrambling for cover, but Feng barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the rift that had begun. By the time the War Council met, Liang Feng had long since returned to the capital. The noise of the battlefield of the war he'd been fighting for years seemed distant now, as though it belonged to another life. He sat at the head of the table, his hands folded in front of him, his face as unreadable as ever. Leaders of his country filled the room, generals, diplomats, and scientists, everyone waiting for Feng to speak. They had been anticipating a victory, one that would allow them to end the war and seize total control of the continent. Feng had been their trump card. The one who could wield all 4 elements, earth, fire, water, and air. He was the key to everything, but they didn't know about the rift. The rift he had seen in the sky. "You've proven yourself once again, Feng," General Zhou said, his voice booming, eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and expectation. Your power is unparalleled. The world is at your feet. Feng didn't respond. His mind was far away, tangled in the realization that what he'd just witnessed could be a harbinger of the end. Not just the war, the world itself. Feng, the president urged. We've come to the point of victory. We need to finish this, once and for all. Feng felt the weight of their gazes pressing on him. They all knew he was the only one who could bring this war to a close, but what none of them realized was that his powers had a cost. A cost so great that every time he used the four elements together, the fabric of reality itself was pushed to the edge of collapse. The more he used it, the closer they came to the brink and the rift. He was sure it had something to do with him, but instead of voicing his concerns, he only nodded. It will end, he said quietly. But not in the way you think. In the days that followed, Feng began his search for answers, though he didn't make it known to the council. His first move was to track down Mira, a rogue elemental who had once been his enemy. She was the only person he trusted with the knowledge of the rift and the terrifying potential of his powers. Mira had a reputation, one that made her both an asset and a liability. She had once been a part of the opposing nation's military, a prodigy with the rare ability to control lightning, an element that didn't belong to the traditional four. Her abilities were unpredictable, wild and dangerous, but Feng knew she was the key to understanding the forces they were up against. It took him days to find her. She wasn't hiding, but she wasn't easy to track either. In the end, Feng found her in a remote village, hiding in plain sight, surrounded by people who knew nothing of her past. She was sitting at a bar, sipping a drink as if she had nothing in the world to worry about. Mira, Feng said, his voice calm but commanding. We need to talk. Mira looked up, her piercing eyes meeting his. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she smirked, tilting her head slightly as she motioned for him to sit. Young Feng, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. To what do I owe the pleasure? Did you come here to lecture me about my betrayal of the great nation? Feng took a seat, his gaze hardening. It's not a lecture. It's a warning. Mira raised an eyebrow. A warning? From you? This should be good. He leaned in, lowering his voice. I've seen something. A rift in the sky. Something that could destroy the world if I don't stop it. But I can't do it alone. Her eyes flickered with something between interest and disbelief. A rift, huh? Sounds like something straight out of a myth. This is no myth, Mira. This is real. And we need to find out what it is before it's too late. Mira leaned back, crossing her arms. You know, you're not exactly selling this like an urgent mission. You look like you just rolled out of bed after a 5-star breakfast. Feng's lips twitched, despite the weight of the situation. If we don't stop it, there won't be a world left to worry about. Fine. So what's the plan? Mira leaned in, a grin spreading across her face. Feng couldn't help but feel a flicker of relief. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so alone. Mira took a long pull from her glass, her eyes never leaving Feng's. He didn't break his stare either, and for a moment, the room felt heavy with unspoken words, like a battlefield before the first strike. She finally set her glass down, her smile widening into something that could only be described as a challenge. You've got guts, I'll give you that. I was expecting you to beg for my help. Instead, you walk in here all serious, like you're the one with the world on your shoulders. She leaned forward, elbows resting on the bar. Let me guess, this rift thing is somehow tied to your 4-elemental power trip, isn't it? Feng's lips twitched. You know more than you're letting on. Myra's eyes flickered with amusement. Maybe. Or maybe I just like making people squirm. Your help is essential, Mira. You're the only person who might understand what's happening. If we don't figure this out soon, everything could. Feng hesitated, but only for a moment. Implode. Implode, huh? She repeated, rolling the word around in her mouth like it was some kind of joke. Sounds dramatic. But I'm guessing you didn't come all the way out here just for a chat. No, Feng admitted. I need you to help me locate the elemental core. We have to destroy it before it's too late. Her face grew serious, just for a moment. The elemental core. I thought that was just a myth. The ancient artifact that controls all the elements? Feng nodded grimly. It's real. And if it falls into the wrong hands, it'll amplify our powers to a point where the world can't survive it. You've seen my abilities. If I push too hard, I could bring about the collapse of everything. So, Mira leaned back in her chair, fingers tapping on the table. You want me to help you track down a mythical artifact to keep you from blowing up the entire world with your amazing abilities? She gave a short, mocking clap. Sounds like fun. Feng met her gaze with quiet intensity. It's not a joke. The rift is just the beginning. And if I'm right, if I'm wrong, then we might not have much time left. Myra's smile dropped, replaced by a flicker of thought. She looked down at the bar, her fingers tapping on her glass, and for a moment, Feng wondered if she was going to walk away. But when she looked up, her expression had shifted from playful to something more calculating, more serious. All right, let's say I believe you. Where do we start? Feng nodded, relieved that she wasn't running in the opposite direction. The elemental core was hidden by the ancient civilization that originally mastered the elements. But it's not easy to find. It's been lost to history. We'll need to search ancient ruins, forgotten temples, and perhaps even make some enemies along the way. Enemies are the fun part, Mira said, grinning again. But fine, we're going to track down this ancient artifact. What's your plan once we find it? Feng met her gaze, his face stern. We destroy it. She tilted her head. That's simple, huh? It's the only way. If I destroy the core, it will strip away the elemental powers of the world. We'll be forced to rebuild the world without the destructive potential of these powers. And you're okay with that? She asked, raising an eyebrow. I mean, no offense, but you've been using those powers like they're your personal playthings for years. No regrets? Feng let out a long breath, his expression softening. Every time I use them, it's harder to control them. The more I tap into all four elements, the more unstable the world becomes. And the rift, it's a sign of what's coming. If I don't do this, I won't be the hero I thought I could be. I'll be the one who ends it all. Mira studied him, her gaze hard to read. Finally, she sighed and shook her head. You're a real piece of work, Feng. But I guess that's what makes this interesting. Thank you, he said dryly. She gave him a mock salute and stood up from the bar. All right, let's go find your elemental core. But don't expect me to do all the work. I've got a reputation to maintain, you know. Feng gave her a small smile. You're right. This isn't a one-man job. They both walked out of the bar into the cool night air. The streets of the city were eerily quiet, as if the war itself had seeped into the very atmosphere. The hum of distant explosions and the occasional crackle of elemental fire echoed in the background, reminding them that time was running out. Mira led the way, her steps quick and purposeful. Feng followed, his mind running through the possibilities. If the core was real, it could change everything. If they found it and destroyed it, the world might finally be able to rebuild, free from the dangers of unchecked elemental power. But could he really give up the very abilities that made him the most powerful person alive? They traveled in silence for hours, their destination still unclear. Feng wasn't sure if Mira knew exactly where they were headed, but her instincts were sharp, and he was starting to trust them. Finally, she stopped in front of an old, dilapidated building on the edge of the city, a place that hadn't been touched by the war, not even once. The building was covered in vines and grime, its windows shattered, but the ancient symbols etched into its stone facade were still visible, if faint. This is it, Mira said, a trace of excitement in her voice. The Temple of the Forgotten Elements. You didn't think it would be easy, did you? Feng nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. This was where it all began. The core had to be here, somewhere beneath their feet. Mira pushed open the door, which creaked loudly in protest, and they stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, but there was something about the place that made the hairs on the back of Feng's neck stand up. As if the building itself knew the weight of what they were about to do, the inside of the temple was vast, with high ceilings that stretched into the darkness above. Stone pillars lined the walls, and strange markings covered the floors. In the center of the room, a massive stone altar stood, half buried in rubble. "This is it, right?" Feng asked, his voice low. Mira knelt in front of the altar, running her fingers over the symbols. "Yeah, this is it. The elemental core should be somewhere beneath this altar." Feng stepped forward, his mind racing. He didn't know what to expect, but something told him that finding the core wouldn't be the hardest part of their journey. The hardest part would be deciding what to do with it. As they began to clear away the rubble, the ground beneath them rumbled. A low, guttural sound reverberated through the temple, and Feng's heart skipped a beat. The walls shook, and the symbols on the floor began to glow with an eerie light. "What the hell?" Mira muttered, stepping back. Before Feng could respond, the ground cracked open. From below, a bright, blinding light shot up, forcing them both to shield their eyes. A deep, resonating hum filled the room, as though the core itself had awoken after centuries of slumber. Feng felt it, a pull in his chest, a strange magnetic force drawing him toward the altar. It was the same pull he had felt when he first discovered his own powers. Only this time, it wasn't just his abilities that responded to the core. It was something far older, something that had been buried deep within the earth itself. "Whatever happens," Feng said, his voice steady, "we destroy it." Mira nodded, her expression grim. "You sure you can handle that?" Feng didn't answer. He was already walking toward the glowing light, each step drawing him closer to the core. The moment his fingers touched the altar, a surge of energy erupted through him, rushing through his veins like wildfire. His breath caught in his throat as the four elements reacted to the core, responding with an intensity he had never felt before. The wind whipped around him, fire flared at his fingertips, and the ground beneath him began to shake. Water gathered around his feet, swirling in a wild, uncontrolled dance. This was it. This was the moment that he didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. This time, he had a choice. A choice to end it all. To stop the madness before it destroyed everything. But would he? Or would he be the one who unleashed the very chaos he had fought so hard to avoid? The light from the core grew brighter. The rift above the temple in the sky pulsed, and then, everything went black. The darkness was suffocating. Feng's body felt weightless, as though he were suspended in space, untethered from the earth. His mind buzzed with static, 1,000 thoughts colliding in a dizzying whirl. For a long moment, he couldn't tell if he was awake or lost in some strange dream, and then, the silence broke. A sound distant at first, then growing louder rumbled through him. It was a hum, like the vibration of the earth's very core. But it wasn't just the earth. It was his own heartbeat, synchronized with the pulse of something far larger than himself. His eyes snapped open, but the world around him remained a swirling void of light and shadow. His body tingled, as if every nerve were alight, suffused with raw, untamed energy. It wasn't just his powers at play anymore. No, this was something different, something ancient. Something that didn't belong to him. He tried to move, but his limbs were heavy, like they were bound in chains of pure force. A feeling of overwhelming presence pressed against him. It was as though the core was speaking to him, not with words, but with pure intent. "Feng," a voice broke through the chaos, a familiar voice. "Mira." He wasn't sure how, but he could sense her, somewhere in the void, her presence as real as his own. "Mira?" His voice felt foreign, weak in the silence. "I'm here," she said, but it wasn't just her voice. It was as if she were speaking through him. Her words resonated in his chest, in his very soul. "We're still in the temple. You need to fight it, Feng. Fight it now." The rift above, the one he'd seen in the sky, echoed in his mind. It felt like a memory, but it was too sharp, too real, for a mere recollection. It was as if the rift was linked to the very pulse of the core, as if both were reaching toward the same terrifying end. His body began to shudder. The elements within him writhed, fire, air, water, earth, clashing and combining in ways they never had before. A tremendous force surged through him, nearly overwhelming him. His powers had always been a part of him, but this felt like something else. Something alive. Something he couldn't control. "Mira," he shouted, but the words dissolved into the ether. The core's energy roiled, intensifying, feeding on his doubt and his fear. It wanted to consume him, to tear through him and take everything. He could feel the pull, like the magnetic force of a star drawing him in, unable to break free. That he thought of the war. The lives lost. The innocent people who had suffered. Was this the price of his power? Was this how it would all end? No, he whispered to himself. I won't let it. I can't. With every ounce of will he had left, Fong forced his mind to focus. He had to stop it. He had to destroy the core. Slowly, painfully, he reached within himself, summoning the power of all four elements at once. The air crackled with lightning, fire licked the ground beneath his feet, and the earth groaned, shifting beneath him. His body pulsed with the weight of the world, but he pushed forward, pulling all the power he could muster into a single, focused point. Myra's voice came again, a quiet whisper in the chaos. Focus, Fong. You can't let it control you. You have to destroy it now. Feng's chest tightened. The core's energy twisted around him, fighting him. It was like holding back an avalanche with bare hands, but he didn't falter. He clenched his fists, pulling the elements together in a brutal rush of power. No more, he growled, with a final cry. Fong thrust his hands toward the altar. The world exploded in light. When Fong awoke, the first thing he felt was the cool air on his skin. He opened his eyes, blinking against the light that flooded his vision. Slowly, his senses returned. He could hear the soft rustle of wind through the broken windows, the distant chirp of birds. The temple was silent, save for the natural sounds of the world outside. He was lying on the cold stone floor, his body sore, exhausted. But the familiar weight of the elements wasn't there. It was gone. For the first time in years, he felt empty. Fong pushed himself up slowly, feeling his muscles protest. The energy that had once surged through him was nowhere to be found. The world felt smaller, quieter, and yet in a strange way, more expansive than it had before. Mira was kneeling nearby, her face tight with concern. She was looking at him with a mixture of disbelief and relief. You did it, she said, her voice a little breathless. You actually did it. He looked around, taking in the aftermath of the battle. The altar was gone, shattered into pieces. The light from the core had vanished, leaving only a faint glow that was slowly fading into nothingness. I think we both did, he murmured. She raised an eyebrow. Don't go getting all sentimental on me, Fong. This isn't a victory if you're going to start acting all humble. Feng's lips quirked into a faint smile. It's over, Mira. The rift, the war. It's over. The words felt strange on his tongue. He wasn't sure if he was speaking about the world's war, or the war that had raged inside himself for so long. Mira stood, brushing herself off. So, what now? You gonna sit here and brood, or are we gonna go home? Fong stood up, his legs still shaky, and took a long look at the ruin around them. He didn't know what would come next. The destruction of the elemental core had obliterated the powers that had shaped their world for so long. Without the core, the elements no longer had a central source. The balance had shifted. We rebuild, he said, his voice steady. We rebuild the world from the ground up. Without the core, without the war. Without this endless cycle of destruction. Mira watched him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she nodded. Rebuilding, huh? Sounds boring. But I guess it's better than blowing everything up. Yeah, Feng agreed. It's better than that. The two of them stood there for a while, looking out at the ruined temple. The world seemed vast and open now, full of possibilities that had once seemed unimaginable. Feng could feel the weight of the choices he had made, the weight of the powers he had once wielded, but it was a weight he was willing to carry. There was no easy path ahead, but for the first time, he felt as if he were walking it on his own terms. Mira, Feng said after a long pause, I think we're going to need a lot of help. Yeah, she said, a grin tugging at her lips. But we've got this. Together. Feng nodded. Together, and for the first time, he truly believed it.